Hi, I'm John Levin. I'm an economist at Stanford University and a member of the Toulouse Network for Information Technology. There's probably two ways of looking at the question of where online commerce is in terms of being old versus new. If you, on the one hand, we're clearly well past the early days of the late 1990s when online commerce started, and there was an initial debate about online taxes. Some of the first evidence, for example, on the effect of online taxes comes from a survey by Forrester Research in the late 90s where the relevant question was, have you ever purchased something online? And only 15% of people had ever purchased something online. So clearly that's ancient history relative to today. On the other hand, online commerce is still only a very small fraction of overall retail commerce, so you could say in some sense it's still early days. There's so many different tax jurisdictions, not just different states having different taxes, but different counties and sometimes even cities, that and there's some fixed cost in setting up a system to collect taxes. And of course, if you have a much larger retailer, they can spread that fixed cost over many more products than a very small business. Well, one place where there's clearly scope for a sort of a higher level solution is to do something to reduce transactions costs. If you have a lot of cross-state trade, to do something that will just simplify the system for collecting sales taxes and make it a relatively low transaction cost thing to do. There's also a question of whether the federal government should step in and adopt some change force some change in the regime in terms of the collection of sales taxes on cross-state trade, and that's a very political question right now. Certainly, if you look at the history, you can point to examples of firms like Amazon that have located strategically in a way that will limit the tax liability on the purchases by, for example, putting distribution centers in Nevada instead of in California, or by locating in Washington State, instead of California. So if you thought about what are the forces driving location, if one of the forces is to locate away from consumers so that there's not a tax liability on the transaction, there's another very strong force, it turns out, which is that people buying online exhibit a remarkably strong preference toward buying relatively local products. In some sense, it's very surprising because we would thought of the internet as being, in some sense, a frictionless market that could create national markets. You think of a market like eBay, it's a completely national, even an international market. But actually, when you look at the distribution of people's purchases, they tend to buy quite locally at the city level, locally at the state level, locally at the regional level. And there's actually a real question as to why exactly people seem to exhibit that kind of preferences. It's hard to account for example, just with shipping costs and shipping time. There seems to be something else going on.